It's time to chill the blood once more. And tonight, this story is frighteningly real. I make no apologies for it. It involves, in part, that nasty instrument of the occult, the Ouija board. This event occurred only about 3 years ago. It happened to a friend of mine. He lived in a large house which had been divided into flats, and his flat was on the ground floor. One night, the people upstairs held a party. This friend was invited, and apparently he had a good time. But about 1:30 or so, people started to drift off home, and he went back downstairs to his flat. The noise from upstairs gradually died down, and about an hour later, all was quiet except for the occasional sound of footsteps. My friend dropped off to sleep. At just before 3:30, he suddenly woke up feeling unaccountably scared. Now, this guy is not the scaring type, so he was a little disturbed to start with because he was experiencing an emotion which was alien to him. All was quiet from upstairs. Despite the feeling of fright persisting, he lay down again and tried to get off to sleep. But he couldn't shift his fear, which was rapidly turning into terror. That's how he described it. He sat up again in bed, and this time he noticed what looked like a glow coming from the foot of his bed. He tried to rationalize by putting it down to a spill of light from the street lamps outside, but when the light began to sort of pulsate, he decided that it must be something else. As indeed, it turned out to be. Slowly, the glow began to take shape, until it had the recognizable form of a man, about 10 feet tall. The features were not discernible, but it seemed to emanate intense evil. He could almost touch it. It was that nasty. The shape stayed there for a period of time. He didn't know how long. And then it began to move towards him. Now, as I said before, this man was not the scarable type. But by now, he was scared. Out of his wits. But as is often the case, he felt paralyzed, unable to move. So great was this fear. And this evil shape continued to move. No, not move, almost glide towards him. It reached the end of his bed, but that didn't stop it. It just glided silently forward, and as it started to invade the space occupied by the bed, the man felt as if a massive weight had been put on the bed and was rolling slowly up the blankets towards his head. He instinctively knew that if this shape reached his head, he would undoubtedly suffocate. And still the shape moved slowly up the bed. Suddenly, just as the shape reached his abdomen, and it felt as if all the air was slowly being forced out of him, he heard an enormous scream. It was one of those screams that seemed to echo long after the initial sound. At this moment, the shape seemed to try to lunge towards his head, but was unable to do so. And then it suddenly disappeared. And the weight went from his body as well, although he still felt weak from the effects of it. Breathing heavily, he got out of bed as quickly as he could and went into the kitchen to make a cup of tea. And then came another blood-curdling scream. Only this time, it came from the flat upstairs. And he heard a loud thump on the ceiling, as if something heavy had been dropped on the floor of the flat above. By now, the scream was more urgent than his recent experience, which he was trying to put down to a bad dream. So he put on his dressing gown and went upstairs to investigate. 2 or 3 other people were going to investigate as well, so at least he had the comfort of knowing that he wasn't the only person who had heard something. They reached the door of the flat above and knocked. And after a while, the owner opened it. In the words of my friend, he looked like death. He was ashen and obviously severely shaken. He seemed to be overjoyed to see the people outside his door, and he invited them in without asking why they were there. They went into the living room, and there were 3 other people there, the man's girlfriend and another couple, and they were all in varying stages of shock. When they'd calmed down, the owner of the flat told them what had happened. Apparently, they were the last people at the party, and being somewhat drunk, someone had suggested that they have a bit of fun. So they made a crude Ouija board. At first, they were all giggly, but it then began to take on a sinister aspect. They began to feel frightened, and the atmosphere went noticeably colder and more oppressive. Then, without warning, they began to get a recognizable message from the Ouija board. It claimed to be from someone with a strange name. Someone challenged this entity to show itself. And it did. It was a huge man, if that is the right word, about 10 feet tall. But it had animal features, not unlike a goat. It began to menace them, and they had all been paralyzed with terror. As it had almost reached one of them, one of the girls had found the strength to scream, and the apparition had turned towards her and fixed her with a cold, fiery stare and started to approach her. Then, after a short while, the other girl had found strength from somewhere and had also screamed and thrown the nearest thing to hand at this being. It was a silver drinks coaster, and as it struck the thing, there was a great flash, the awful stench of burnt meat, and the thing disappeared. Not long afterwards, my friend and his neighbors arrived. My friend told me of this event a few days afterwards, and one of the first questions I asked him was, what was the name that had been spelled out by the Ouija board? He told me, and I recognize it as the name of a very powerful black entity. I won't even repeat it to you now, because it's a name which, if misused, I firmly believe could lead to all sorts of nasty things. Suffice to say that I went to see the couple who had experienced this event and satisfied myself that they had no knowledge of the occult, and they certainly didn't know the significance of this name. If they had, they would have stopped immediately. The postscript to this salutary tale is that from then onwards, the house seemed to become unfriendly. So much so that not only did this couple move out after about 6 months, but my friend also moved out a short time afterwards. His excuse was that he wanted to change, but I know it was more than that.